Hello and Sup ID, my name is Brian Talbot, and I am the Lau Minnesotan Poet Laureate and Ambassador for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about some common concepts in speculative poetry. For the better part of my journey as a poet over the past 30 years, much of my work has fallen into the scope of speculative poetry, which is, in particular, work that incorporates a response to the themes, motifs, techniques, and opportunities found within the genre arts and literature, but this does not only include fantasy, but science fiction, horror, mythology, and other works not necessarily studied at an academic level in various countries, although this is shifting. Speculative poetry certainly has existed well before the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, or the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, or the Horror Writers Association, but these are certainly networks you might wish to approach to start getting your bearings in the field and to see who is creating what in our modern times. The leading awards in speculative poetry include the Rieslingen, Dwarf, Elgin, and Stoker, but others have emerged as well, and many poets have achieved acclaim with speculative poems individually or as entire collections. Speculative poetry often includes the tradition of poets such as Homer, Dante, Poe, Milton, Sun Ra, and many others, but some might argue that speculative poetry has gained the most traction in the late 20th century to the present. For those curious to see the different approaches to writing speculative poetry across the globe, I will recommend the anthology edited by Stephanie M. Whiteovich, Writing Poetry in the Dark, from Raw Dog Screaming Press. It features many of our leading speculative poets weighing in on their techniques today, and is highly recommended. So, with that preface out of the way, I thought it might be of interest for some of you to see some of the more specialized common terms we will run into in speculative poetry, and I will try to provide some commentary on how more common terms within poetry and publishing apply to speculative verse. I certainly welcome others to expand on these brief definitions and encourage you to share your own thoughts on your blogs and articles in the noosphere. So let's begin. The dwarf or dwarf poem and sci-fi-ku and horror-ku are some of the terms that are frequently applied to very short poems. The term sci-fi-ku has been in use since approximately 1995, while the dwarf star idea emerged approximately in 2005-2006, and this has come to include sci-fi-ku, tanka, sinkans, and other forms. Currently, these are poems that are a maximum of 10 lines long, not counting the title, epigraph, dedication, or stanza breaks. Prose poems in this category usually capped at a maximum of 100 words, or also known as the drabble form. Poems that are mixed prose and line-broken will often be determined proportionately. Of course, the next concept is the idea of a short poem. In speculative poetry, these are most often considered poems that are 11 to 49 lines long, or in the case of prose poems, 101 to 499 words. For context, a typical sheet of 8.5 inch by 11 paper has between 19 to 25 lines with a 12-point font and 1 inch margins, and it's 1.5 to double-spaced, which is considered the typical format and standard in the US. An A4 sheet of paper is going to be within roughly the same parameters. The prose poem format depends widely on the roots in French verse in the 1800s. These are written typically in sentence format without line breaks, resembling paragraphs. These poems will have lyrical elements and figurative language, rhythm, structure, and employ techniques that are particular to verse. The long poem in speculative poetry is often considered to be a poem that is between 50 to 299 lines long, or in the case of prose poems, 500 to 1,999 words. Poems that exceed this limit tend to fall in the epic category or are just considered chapbooks. The epic poem is about 3,000 to 15,500 lines or more, and it's considered the threshold of an epic poem if we're looking at antecedents such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, Dante's Divine Comedy, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ramayana, Paradise Lost, Beowulf, or Rime of the Ancient Mariner, just to name a few. The rules for an epic poem length will vary from culture to culture and age to age. An epic poem might become holy or revered, or it may merely be long. A chapbook or zine is considered a single-author collection of 10 to 39 pages of verse, the majority of which are speculative in nature when considered for awards and other opportunities in the field. This typically excludes consideration of illustrations in the page count and footnotes, endnotes, forewords, indices, appendixes, and other matter. The term chapbook emerged around 1824, though the tradition seems to go back as far as the 1500s. A zine is similar, but can also include multiple contributors, not just a single author, which is more common with a chapbook. Current scholarship suggests that the idea and term zine can be traced back to a 1940 science fiction fanzine by Russ Chauvenet, popularized in fandom, entering the Oxford English Dictionary in 1949. Usually, a zine is between 100 to 1,000 copies, but there's no strict rule on this. The zine has often had strong ties to punk history and niche genres and areas of interest. A full-length collection in speculative poetry is considered 40 pages or more, and while there is no upper limit, over 300 pages is rare, with an exception like Toby Barlow's Sharp Teeth. 80 to 120 pages seems to be a current median. As for collaboration, typically a full-length collection with 2 or more poets and artists, and often under 5, constitutes a collaboration, at which point beyond that it starts getting into the domain of anthologies. 2 poets or artists working together on a single manuscript in collaboration has served a variety of aesthetic and literary purposes, and generally the collaborators are considered to have equal stand-in to the other, rather than a presentation by a mentor and mentee, master and apprentice, etc., etc. When it comes to an anthology, usually in speculative poetry, this is considered a collection of shorter works, but not full chapbooks or full-length collections by different authors. And the anthology often features unrelated topics and settings, or else it is based on a particular theme and focus collected into a single volume for publication. An alternate interpretation is that an anthology can be a work by a single author in multiple genres, say, a collection of poetry, short story, flash fiction, novellas, plays, and so on. The concept of the anthology goes back to the 1600s, but in the 20th century it became a format particularly important for poets, with many used to mark out the boundaries of a particular generation or movement of poets. It was handy when many might otherwise have struggled to gain formal publication on their own through more traditional publishing houses, especially if it came from a historically marginalized community. When it comes to journals or magazines, these traditions emerged from the mid-1600s as a collection of writings by various authors on a regular basis, the most common being monthly, quarterly, or bi-monthly, and in rare instances weekly, but almost never daily, at which point we might consider that a newspaper. In speculative poetry, there does not appear to currently be a regular speculative poetry newspaper for a number of reasons. The journal or magazine is typically funded by subscriptions, cover prices, and occasionally advertising and sponsorships. There are a few journals and magazines strictly dedicated to speculative poetry, reviews, and commentary, with most including visual art, short stories, novellas, and creative nonfiction in their pages, and speculative poetry providing a marginal element of content. These publications can get distributed by paid, unpaid, and controlled circulation, depending on the model the publisher prefers. The major difference between journals and magazines tends to typically be a question of pagination more than anything else. Somewhat uncommon but not unheard of, the broadside is a large poster, usually at least 11 by 17 inches, but dimensions vary, that first emerged in the 1500s. They have printing on only one side, but can include artistic prints and illustrations, or photography to accompany the text for aesthetic effect. In the past, European broadsides were used for announcements of proclamations, social commentaries, advertisements, and so on. In the mid-1800s, the rise of newspapers and novels led to decreased use of a broadside for street literature. The U.S. Declaration of Independence was initially a broadside of 200 copies. Small printers and publishers often produce fine art broadsides of poems that would ideally be framed and hung on a wall, although it is unclear how many are actively engaged in this format for speculative poetry in a regular fashion. Somewhat new, speculative poetry installations or exhibits are these short-term events in galleries, coffee houses, and other art spaces where one or more poets may have examples of their speculative poetry and thematically related artwork on display for view, and in many instances it's possible to purchase them as prints or originals after the exhibit. This would not necessarily be a situation where only one poem was included in passing, responding to a more central artwork or artworks, but this is getting into the nitty-gritty details, I suppose. Now, More common to those working in spoken word and performance poetry, you will occasionally find albums or films of speculative poetry read by one or multiple poets of their own work or those of famous speculative poets, most commonly, of course, Edgar Allan Poe and figures in the public domain. Short films and videos have increasingly been made to share speculative poems, but these are rarely presented beyond a documentation of a poet reading their work with some manner of imagination. There are a few instances that immediately come to mind of a speculative poem that has the production values of certain comic book movie franchises, although some have suggested the recent Netflix series based on the works of Edgar Allan Poe might be adjacent to the premise. With the rise of video games and board games in the 20th century and the democratization of many of the tools needed to develop them, we have seen emerging examples of interactive speculative poems in the vein of choose-your-own text adventures or games, where poetry is a significant element of a game and not just an allusion or flavor text. Speculative poetry is written in multiple languages and can be found with many traditions. The field is still emerging, however, for dedicated translators of strictly speculative poetry, and most translation efforts presently tend to be given from one language into English. This may change in the near future, however, on different continents. A hazard in speculative poetry is that 20th and 21st century speculative poetry is largely not in the public domain or Creative Commons, but speculative poetry publishers and poets have often struggled just getting published in one language, so efforts to get translated into others as a smooth process has proven unnecessarily Herculean. And there are few things more heartbreaking than a speculative poem with a dull, lifeless translation that might as well have been fed into a search engine translator on the cheap. But that's turning into a big commentary. The idea of experimental speculative poetry will have many different meanings to different poets, both within speculative poetry and poetry as a whole. For some, it's a specific discipline of technique and topoi, while for others, it's just a question of format. Experimental poetry can include graphopoetics, the counterpart to graphic novels, but can also be said to have forebears in many classical Asian poems, or works of William Blake and others. In other instances, it may be a radical sound, or tone poems, or public art installations, or examples of book art where it is not mass-produced but created as a singular or limited edition object art. This element of course may include performance art, interpretive dance, and other unusual approaches to presentation, or be much more low-key and subtle in its efforts. But what other concepts or terms should we share with readers? Please let me know. And thank you for listening. I'm Brian Talwar, and have a great day.